Hello there and happy Friday. I'm so glad you joined me today. My name is Julie Hirschberg. I am the owner and founder of Reactive Therapy and Wellness here in the Los Angeles area and join you live every week to share a little bit of lately, it's been what I've been reading. I have been immersed in a lot of interesting literature, and I love to share it with you. But what we're reading, what we're learning, what we're doing as a team here at Reactive, we've got this amazing team from a wellness team to psychology, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and a whole education team. And this particular, what I want to bring to you today, was something that was shared with me from colleagues that are teaching a free webinar for us on vestibular migraine. And I don't know about you, but migraine and our understanding of migraine has evolved a lot. I didn't learn about vestibular migraine in school. It is, and my understanding of it has evolved a lot over the last few years. And a big part of that is from knowing Jamie and Catherine. They are neuro PTs and dizziness gurus, and we've been so lucky to have them in our community, our Brain Bites community. And they've started teaching about dizziness and mentoring others. And they're sharing a live webinar with us this month of May on vestibular migraine. In fact, it's called Vestibular Migraine, Desperately Seeking Stability, and a little play on one of my favorites from the 80s, Desperately Seeking Susan. I think it was Madonna's acting debut. So they shared this article that I wanted to share with you today. I'm going to pull it up here. So that I can get it right. It's called Abnormal Visual-Vestibular Interactions in Vestibular Migraine. And this was a cross-sectional study. This came out in Brain, the Journal of Neurology in 2019. And this was a European group actually across the UK, Switzerland, Brazil as well. So an interesting group, and it's really interesting what they did. So I want to give you just a little bit of background first. First of all, vestibular migraine is actually very common. It's common in the headache clinic, in a neuro-otology clinic as well, and it is one of the most prevalent causes of an episodic vertigo. Many people have heard of Meniere's, another maybe similar kind of issue of episodic vertigo. And one of the things that can be found in vestibular migraine is that people have these abnormalities of self-motion perception. So maybe they feel that they're rocking or spinning or kind of dissociated, but an overall spatial disorientation. And that was kind of the reason behind this study, is to look at that in a little more detail. There have been some neuroimaging studies with vestibular migraine that show some altered metabolic activity in the brain. And also some studies that show some changes during tilt, so some abnormal thresholds during tilt. And so what this group really wanted to look at is to see if people with vestibular migraine would have altered vestibular ocular reflexes. So those can be tested, the VOR, and their perception of movement. And this would be a way to test out if they have some abnormal visuo-vestibular cortical interactions. We've been talking a lot about mechanisms and functional connectivity. So this is another piece of functional connectivity that might have gone awry in a vestibular migraine. So of course I'm interested in this. It's really, really interesting. So it's kind of, I wish I was sharing my screen to show you what they actually did. So let me kind of take you through the experiment. So imagine the person sitting in the chair. They actually put on some white noise so that they wouldn't get a kind of sound signal of what was occurring. And then they have a clicker to to click when a clicker to click, that sounds so silly, but that's the best words I've got right now, to click when they perceived movement. So they actually measured vestibular ocular reflex thresholds with electrooculography, EOG, and then they measured vestibular perceptual threshold. So when the person perceived they were moving, so not just their eye movements or nystagmus, but whether they perceived they were moving with the button. So they did this with movement in this yaw plane, so horizontal plane, in both directions. Then this is what's really interesting. Then they added a visual motion. So they put up like an optokinetic curtain, black and white stripes, and moved that around in the right direction for 5 minutes. So then they get this visual. Sorry, could you say that? Siri thinks I'm talking to her. Visual motion added on top. So they did the visual motion, then they did the task again. So this is where it is really interesting. What they found is changes in the perception, as well as actually the vestibular ocular reflex thresholds, both before, so this was present just in people with vestibular migraine, but also after the visual motion. Really, really interesting. And what was most interesting to me is that they found that the thresholds were higher. So it took more movement for the person with vestibular migraine to perceive movement. They also found the threshold for the ocular motion was higher. So, by the way, I forgot this point. They actually looked at this in healthy controls, people with BPPV, people with just migraine, not vestibular migraine, and then people with vestibular migraine. So I actually think this is great because then they could compare and contrast these. So first, then, vestibular migraine, those with vestibular migraine and BPPV had elevated ocular and perceptual thresholds at baseline. So this was before the visual motion test. This was compared to healthy controls and people with migraine, but not vestibular migraine. So that's really interesting. That tells us a little bit about BPPV as well. But the real big difference is that following the visual motion exposure, that the people with vestibular migraine had an even higher ocular, so their VOR threshold, and perceptual threshold increased even more. And this was different than the other groups. Isn't that interesting? I find that really, really interesting. So that's basically saying their perception and their threshold of movement got worse after the visual exposure. And this did not change in a person with BPPV. So this is not purely just a vestibular phenomena. It's not just a migraine phenomena. It is a vestibular migraine phenomena for sure. The other thing that was interesting is that there was a mismatch between the ocular threshold and the perceptual threshold. So those two did not match. And you could imagine that that also could cause some disorientation in the person. And then finally, there were errors to gauge the direction that they were moving. And there were more errors in those with vestibular migraine. Again, honestly, so many interesting pieces of data here in this article. So what does this all mean, right? What does that mean for vestibular migraine? What does that mean for our understanding? And honestly, I know Jamie and Catherine are really going to put this into a framework of understanding vestibular migraine to go into treatment in our course or in their webinar that is coming up, because I got a sneak peek at the slides and they are gorgeous and amazing. So, but let's talk a little bit about what it means. So, one, in vestibular migraine and BPPV, we know that patients have this abnormally elevated threshold for VOR and the perception of self motion. And that after, for somebody with a vestibular migraine, after they have a visual motion exposure, that's even more off. Um, there's also even more of an exaggeration, a mismatch between the VOR and the perceptual threshold of movement. Um, Again, after visual motion. And then finally, this like degree of spatial disorientation. So that's kind of a summary of all the results though. So how do we relate this to what we know and understand about vestibular migraine? First, we know that people with vestibular migraine will have some and can report some visually induced dizziness. And this is really kind of why they did this study, is to see why is that occurring for someone? And potentially this is supporting a disruption in that visual vestibular cortical interaction. So those interactions between the visual and vestibular pathways. And this is really like one possible explanation is that the visual motion that they had in this study has an effect and actually might suppress some of those vestibular thresholds. So that's one option, but what the authors really say here is that an alternative explanation is that the presence of greater noise. So kind of think like ringing in the ear, right? So greater noise, but not auditory, but vestibular noise. Vestibular noise in some of those vestibular cortical areas and networks that happens in patients that are dizzy. And in fact, they even use the term vestibular tinnitus. Potentially, that is impacting the person's perception and their ability to detect self motion, which you could imagine if you're having trouble detecting self motion, that you would feel really dizzy and disoriented, maybe even dissociated from your body. So I honestly kind of like this alternative explanation of this like noise in the vestibular system, kind of like a sensory noise, a dizziness noise. And they hypothesize that maybe what's happening is this is slowing down or making more difficult the brain's decision-making process to detect motion in the body. And it takes a longer time to reach a decision about the directionality. This is why they would have more errors, right? So I think that this is really interesting to think about and could lead us to think about how can we decrease the noise in the system, the dizziness noise. And again, I'm kind of thinking autonomic, right? And sensory system. So how can we decrease the noise in the system? And then how can we improve the person's ability to detect change? I think that lends itself to vestibular rehab, to be honest, right? And I know that actually in their webinar, having gotten a sneak peek at it, that is one of the big pieces that they're going to talk about is how can we rehabilitate this and help people with vestibular migraine. So anyway, that was one of the really cool articles that really blew my mind. Catherine and Jamie shared their slides this week with me, and I saw this article and I was like, I got to read this. And wow, it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense from a mechanistic standpoint. And then what we hear from patients and how we can treat it. I think it's really very, very interesting. So if you haven't already signed up, you can go to reactiveeducation.com/vestibular migraine. That's this free webinar coming up May 17th and 21st. There's a couple days you could choose from. Totally free, 90 minutes of learning with Catherine and Jamie. I think it's going to uh, blow your mind like it has mine already. So I hope you'll join us for that webinar. And again, if you're not already on our newsletter, you can join that at reactiveeducation.com or reactivept.com if you're a person with a neurologic disorder. And we'll send out the links. We'll send out all these article links too. This one particularly is free full text. I'll send those all out in our newsletters this week. And thanks so much for joining me. I will catch you next time.